What happens when you add a dragon epoxy design to the top of a light-up chessboard? This! Hope you enjoy it, and welcome to Howdies. This set started similar to my last light-up chessboard. I used curly red oak and then clear epoxy alternating squares. I measured and cut a baseboard and covered it in clear packing tape before gluing the 2x2 oak squares onto it. I built a quick frame using scrap wood, silicone, and packing tape so I could then pour the first layer of epoxy. I won't go too far into the details and the problems created because it's covered in my other light-up chessboard build, but I will summarize it by saying I failed to properly seal the oak squares and created a bubble nightmare. As a quick fix, I trimmed the sides of the board and reframed it to add some white opaque epoxy into the see-through squares. This would allow the light to still come through, but would mask the excessive bubbles. After adding in the white epoxy, I created a swirl design on each of the squares for aesthetic purposes. I then removed the board again from the frame and trimmed up all four sides using my table saw and sled. I ran the piece through my drum sander and used the 80 grit paper to level both the top and the bottom of the board. To seal the wood, I added a layer of shellac and let it dry thoroughly. I glued the piece to the frame using the blue tape and CA glue method. I built a frame again using scrap wood, silicone around the edges, and lining the sides in clear packing tape to easily remove the epoxy top coat I was about to pour. I then added the top coat to serve as the etched design layer. This is the layer where the CNC will actually etch out the design that I want. I let the epoxy fully set. I removed the piece from the frame. I trimmed the edges again, and then I readied it for the CNC machine. On Etsy, I found a great circular dragon design in SVG format. I purchased it and uploaded it to my computer. Using Easel, which is the CNC software compatible with my Inventable CNC machine, I imported the design and set the cut parameters to a depth of roughly 1/5 of an inch. I let the CNC make the design cut into the top layer. Go little CNC machine, go. In hindsight, this likely should have been deeper so that the inserted epoxy design would stand out more. After the cutting was completed, I covered the design with a generous layer of shellac to fill the wood and avoid more bubbles on the next epoxy pour. I mixed up some red epoxy for the first side of the design and poured it into the first dragon and the highlights. I then repeated the process with some light blue epoxy for the second dragon and his highlights. As I mentioned previously, I could have made the design either deeper or used more color, more pigment for the highlighted red and blue epoxy. Although it came out great in the end, it definitely could have used more color to make the design stand out when the lights were on. Once dried, I used the drum sander again to flatten the top of the chessboard using 80 grain. For the edging, I cut 4 strips of figured walnut, each containing some sapwood to add some variation to the final piece, and glued them to the side of the board using CA glue. Wood glue would have probably been fine, but it might have left a yellow finish on the see-through portions of the chess squares, so I tried to use CA glue as opposed to wood glue for this particular project. Since the entire top will be covered in epoxy, I think just using CA glue will be plenty secure. I trimmed the overhangs on the edging using my table saw sled and added a layer of CA glue where the trim came in contact with the board. This was primarily to avoid gaps and potential bubbles once the final top coat is added. Using the drum sander, I leveled all sides of the top and hand sanded down the edges and corners of the trim to a smooth finish. Using compressed air, I blew the dust and debris off and then cleaned it more thoroughly with acetone to assure it was free of any excess before the final top coat. I put on another coat of shellac to assure that any wood that was exposed, like the edging for example, would be sealed before the final top coat. Finally, I mixed up some epoxy, poured it over the top and sides, and used a brush to evenly distribute it over the top of the chessboard. I cleaned up the bottom epoxy drips with my random orbital sander, cleaned the bottom of the piece, and added a layer of shellac to protect any exposed wood on the bottom of the board. I then set it aside to build the frame. For the frame, I cut up 4 sections of a 2x4 piece of pine to serve as the holder for the chessboard. I wanted the bottom of the frame to be eraser board, which ultimately would hold all of the chess pieces inside. So I measured the width and used my table saw to cut a groove on the inside of each of the 4 frame sections. They were cut about a 1/2 inch from the bottom, and they were cut the width of the eraser board. I then used my table saw to cut 2 more grooves, which were wider and less deep, to hold the strip lights. Take a look at my other light-up chessboard build if you want more details on cutting these grooves into the frame. After the cuts, I taped and painted the inside of the 2x4s black and added a slight gap at the top so the chessboard would fit inserted into the top of the frame once it was assembled. I sanded the frame pieces to be smooth and then added Minwax finish to the outside of each of the pieces. Next, it was time to cut the 45-degree corners and glue them up. I used my digital angle finder to set my blade to 45 degrees and cut the first angle into each of the 2x4s. I then measured and marked the final lengths of each 2x4 and cut the corresponding 45-degree angles on the other side of each piece. I put the 4 sides together and checked, making sure that my top piece, the chessboard, still fit properly into the 4 corners. For the bottom of the base, the eraser board, I measured from the edge of the inserted gap to the other side of the gap. You want to make sure that you are measuring from one gap edge to the other gap edge so that your piece, the bottom, the eraser board, will fit properly and securely into the bottom of the frame. If you simply cut the eraser board bottom to the same size as your frame, it will not sit inside of the grooves. I cut the eraser board to my measured and correct size and did a final check with the gaps. Unfortunately, I needed to expand them slightly so that the eraser board would better fit, so I ran each of the 2x4s through the table saw one more time to assure that there was a clean fit. To try and do a better job lining up the 45-degree angles on my glue up, as opposed to the last time I did a 45-degree glue up, I created 4 scrap pieces of 2x4 and cut 90-degree notches into them. I added packing tape to them and then used them on each of the 4 corners for the glue up in an attempt to keep all the pieces secured. As you can see, this allowed me to clamp in a cross-section format. Unfortunately, even with this foolproof method, the corners still had gaps in them. So, as with my last board frame, I cut 1-inch corners out of each of the corners to add a pillar. Using some scrap pieces of walnut, I cut out 1-by-1-inch pillars and glued them into the 4 corners, clamping them securely and using lots of glue. After the glue dried, I drilled a hole in the corner to run the power cord into the bottom and began running the strip lights around the 2 shallow grooves around the board. My 8-foot strip light off Amazon, which was actually fairly inexpensive, wound perfectly just under 2 full times around the board, which meant there was plenty of light inside to light it up well. Unlike my mistake on the last board, the last time I used these strip lights, where I used super glue and tried to glue it in, this time I simply took the red part off and used the adhesive that was already on the strip light when I installed them. To finish off the project, I added a light coat of shellac to the wood frame. Time to put it all together. Here you go. I think it came out pretty well for my second board build ever. Hope you picked up a few tips from this build. I know I sure did as I was doing it. All right, guess I'm going to have to learn how to play this chess game if I keep building these chessboards. In a future video, I'll show you how I made these custom chess pieces shown here, which really highlight the light-up capabilities of the board. Anyways, thanks for your comments, likes, subscriptions, and views, and I'll see you on the next build. Howdies out.